We are here from the Gender-Based Violence Settlement Sector Strategy Project, and we're just welcoming folks to come into the room. I can see a few more participants arriving. So I'll just wait a minute here while people are coming in, and I can introduce the name of our project. It's the National Gender-Based Violence Settlement Sector Strategy, Building Capacity and Collaboration. So we're pleased to be joining you from our Pathways to Prosperity, a virtual series. And today's February 28th we have here, and these are the organizations working together in this project. Here's our logos here at the bottom. So I'll introduce the panelists. We have with us today Valerie Auger-Voyer, and she is the Stakeholder Engagement and Advocacy Coordinator at the Ending Violence Association of Canada. And myself, I'm Catherine at the YMCA of Greater Halifax Dartmouth, the Centre for Immigrant Programs. Charlene Connors is here from the Elmwood Community Resource Centre. She's the representative for CISA ACSE on our partnership and works as the counseling manager at Elmwood. Brianna Miller is the coordinator of our gender-based violence prevention project here at YMCA in Halifax, and also the leader of our champion network, National Champion Network on GBV. And Margarita Pinten-Perez is the senior coordinator of the Initiative to End Gender-Based Violence at OCASI. So we work together on this project, and of course the group does a number of other things too, but for this project, we meet almost weekly to develop tools and resources for the settlement sector about gender-based violence. And one of the things we didn't discuss actually is our land acknowledgement, but I would like to say that we are coming, or I am here on Mi'kma'ki, the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people here in Nova Scotia, and we are all treaty people. We recognize that the land is unceded and that we're grateful to be able to work on it. So to carry on here, our objectives for the day and our agenda are here on our slide 3. So welcome and objectives. We will be identifying the definitions of sexual and gender-based violence, key approaches in this work, some of the key approaches that are used. We intend to provide practical tools and resources on gender-based violence, mostly toward the end of the presentation, which we have set for an hour. And at the end, of course, we'll have time for questions, about 15 minutes at the end of our hour together. And we plan to offer best practices with disclosures individually and in groups. A lot of our work's in group sessions in settlement, in the settlement sector. Considerations when working with newcomers. We'll be explaining risk factors, some barriers to accessing gender-based violence services, and we intend to share how to find additional training and resources on the topic, of which there is a lot of training and resources and promising practices across the country. So in terms of our icebreaker, we don't have a lot of interaction here in this hour together, but I would like to take a moment to have our audience consider what you do for self-care, and to keep that in mind after participating in this presentation today, because gender-based violence is a difficult topic, and it's an issue that affects all of us. It's very prevalent in Canada, and so you may have had some experience with someone you know, or someone in your community that's experienced gender-based violence, and so important in this hour to be aware of how you're feeling. If you need to take a break, have a glass of water, or take a stretch, that's a great way to stay grounded. And if something comes up for you, you can talk to someone in your circle to offer support or receive support. So just with regards to self-care, there are a couple of things to be aware of, and that in our work, we really need to avoid burnout and compassion fatigue by doing things for ourselves that are nurturing and enriching and encouraging our organizations to also support that. and also in our communities. So compassion fatigue is when a person feels hopeless about possibilities for change, and burnout is due to workload and feeling that there's too much work to do. So self-care is meant to balance those kinds of difficulties at work, and is really an important part of what we do to keep things going well. And also in our workplaces, we need to make sure that our colleagues also are aware of that. We make time for taking care of ourselves in our organizations. So I'm going to turn it over to Margarita now, and she's going to do the next part here on definitions and carrying us through to the approaches. So I'm just gonna have to just find my
Sure. Thank you, Catherine.
camera. I'll just find my camera and then I'll be away. Here we go.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Welcome.
much. Great. Thanks, Catherine. All right. So we're going to just start off with kind of an overview in a really kind of, perhaps most of you will know a lot of this information, but it's good to do kind of a basic overview around what we're referring to when we're talking about gender-based violence, which is going to be the discussion today. And helpful for you to think about some different approaches when we're thinking about addressing, responding to GBV. So to start, I think it's helpful for us to think about what is GBV? What exactly are we talking about when we're thinking about gender-based violence? So we know that gender-based violence, it is a violence that's committed against someone based on their gender identity, gender expression, or perceived gender. And we know that there's different manifestations of gender-based violence in terms of, and I'll discuss this a little bit further along, but the different kinds of harms and violence. It can be physical, emotional, psychological, or sexual in nature. And it can also include, for example, like the denial of resources or access to services, right? So we do use this term also more as an umbrella term. So some of you might hear, for example, violence against women, or family violence, or intimate partner violence, sexualized violence. There's different ways that we talk about it, but we're thinking about it within this idea and framing of gender. So that's what's important for us to keep in mind. If we go on to the next slide. Okay. So when we're thinking about gender-based violence and how it disproportionately, actually, I think what's better to frame it is that when we're thinking about GBV, we sometimes and commonly could hear the expression of violence against women. And there's a reason for that, is because when we're thinking about gender-based violence, a lot of emphasis has been made around thinking and discussing and addressing VAW, violence against women, because we know that it disproportionately impacts women and girls at a global level. In fact, we know that when we're thinking about, in particular, intimate partner violence, violence against women, we know that it's a major health problem and a violation of women's human rights. So you'll see here we have a few different statistics that are out there in terms of estimates that were published by the World Health Organization that indicate that about 1 in 3, so that's about 35% of women worldwide, have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime, or that 1 woman or girl is killed every other day on average in the context of Canada. It's about once a week a woman is killed by her male partner in Canada, or that in a single day in 2019, there was over 1,800 women and 1,500 children that were staying in shelters or transition houses. So those are impactful numbers. That's a reality in terms of which we're talking about GBV, and in particular when we're focused on VAW, that's why you'll see that emphasis there. I think also it's important, and yeah, thank you, Catherine. So just one point also around when we're thinking about GBV and how it disproportionately impacts, I think this is also becomes a conversation about how GBV then also impacts communities in unique ways. And so that's when we come into this conversation when we're thinking about newcomer women and girls. And perhaps in this case, we might not have that there's higher rates of GBV in terms of reporting, but we know that there's different risks and different contexts and situations in which people are made more vulnerable in terms of GBV. And then at the same time, making it a lot harder for certain communities to reach support and access to healing, right? So some examples when we're thinking about accessing services and how this might be different for different communities, especially when we're thinking about newcomer women and girls, is that there might be higher rates of isolation. We also have to consider racism, right? And I'll focus on that in a moment when I talk a little bit about our approaches. But you also are thinking about language and cultural barriers, issues around economic dependence, lack of knowledge about, for example, community resource or what's out there in terms of supports and help. This is a major one that we think of at OCASI as we're thinking about immigration status and how much that essentially builds a relationship to people here in Canada, right? Either in a temporary way or a permanent way. And then that determines what you're eligible for in terms of supports and services, right? So immigration status is something we really think about. Other examples that we have here is that perhaps accessing supports and services might lead to stigma from their community, or they're afraid of other forms of oppression that they might experience, including racism, right? Sexism, those types of things. Their concern, right, in terms of for their family that's now part of a new community in a new country. And also a lack of awareness around different types of accommodation that might be available to them for different religious and cultural differences. And we think about that in particular for shelter and transitioning housing, right? So if we move on, these are different forms of gender-based violence. So I did touch on, what is gender-based violence? I did explain a little bit about how there's different forms of GBV. Here we have different examples. We have physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse. There can be neglect, criminal harassment, technology-assisted violence, which for some of you that might have been paying attention to that conversation around GBV and violence during COVID, we learned about different ways in which that was occurring with technology. And that's not necessarily because of COVID, but just those examples were emphasized during that time. There's also what's called so-called honor violence, earlier forced marriage. So there's different examples when we're talking about the different forms of GBV. And I think what's really helpful here is to think about this in a way that these are different expressions and forms of GBV, but at the root of it is still this emphasis on gender, right? And different powers of structure. That's really important because sometimes, and I'll start to discuss this now when we get into the approaches, but sometimes there can be an emphasis, and this is why we have it in quotes, so-called honor violence, right? As one of the forms, is that there can be a lot of backlash and racism that's enacted against certain communities that become kind of known, or there's a certain type of violence or form of violence that's attached to that community, to that culture. And then that can lead to different conversations that can perpetuate other forms of harm and racism and cultural attacks and all sorts of stuff there. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize here is that at the root of all these different forms of violence, it is really important for us to keep in mind the conversation and the discourse around power and the conversation around gender, right? And that there might be different manifestations of harm and violence, but that this is something that we're talking about at a global scale that impacts all of our communities. All right, so if we move on to our key approaches, and I'm kind of touching on this or aiming to touch on this. Let me just check the chat in case there's something. Okay, let me just touch on this really quickly, is that when we're talking about GBV, and I'll give you some of this example from my own work at OCASI, which is the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, is that we're not able to just talk about GBV because our clients and the people that we work with and support are working with clients who are newcomers, who in Canada are racialized, who might be experiencing all various different forms of oppression. And so that means that they're living within this kind of intersectional reality. So their GBV might be, when we're talking about violence and harm, that might be a reason that they're going to different organizations to seek support and help, or it might be for a different reason that they're there. But you have to think about that whole reality, that big picture. And I find that these approaches that we're going to talk about and just briefly touch on today, really, because there's a lot, you can do a big deep dive into it. But just as we're going to touch on today, it's just about keeping in mind that we can't see things in isolation or through a narrow framing. So this is where these approaches, I think of them as like goggles. It's kind of like, or a perspective, a lens, right? It's helpful when you think about it that way, because it's allowing you to think about, for example, the different intersections, right? That the vulnerability might not only be related to gender-based violence, but also other experiences they're having because of their immigration status, because of their class in Canada, because of religion, right? And this is going to impact a series of other things like their access to justice, their access to housing, right? So this is what we're trying to touch on. With these approaches, you're kind of trying to see a person beyond a one dimension, but seeing them in that 3D, 4D kind of perspective. So let's start with the first one. With intersectionality, which will be the key first approach that I'm talking about. It's, we're not in person, so I can't see it, but I have a feeling that if I were to ask the room who has heard of this term, a lot of people would raise their hand. So we've heard of this term for a long time. It has a history, and it was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it has a history about talking about discrimination and harm and how it wasn't possible at the time for Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a lawyer, to think about her client through that single lens. She couldn't just think about the discrimination or harm that was due to gender, but she also had to think there's something related to racism here, right? So she talks about it as this metaphor, this intersection, which is really helpful. This is a fantastic, what you're seeing here. Hopefully you were able to download and see some of this information that we're sharing, but this is like a wheel that you're seeing to think about those different intersections, right? There's the identity of people, there's the structures, there's the different things that make them unique. So you're seeing this wheel kind of identify those different intersections. So intersections and intersectionality for me is really helpful in our work. So you see the layers. And so that you also see that there's not always a hierarchy, that these things are happening simultaneously, right? Which is what makes it really tricky, which is why we often talk about GBV being so complex to address or respond to. I'll carry on very quickly because I know I'm probably taking up a lot of time. Then when we're thinking about anti-oppression really refers to strategies, theories, different actions that challenge, things that have been historically built into our systems and our society, the inequalities, right? The injustices. And I think of anti-oppression from a bigger, like a general, more broader lens, right? That's allowing us to think, okay, this is some of the personal kind of social problems that are taking place, but we can see their connection, right? To broader kind of social and economic structures, right? So I think that's what's helpful. It's asking you to say, okay, this is something that's unique to that's happening to an individual, but I can see some of its roots in these types of oppression. For example, roots related to patriarchy. We might be thinking about racism, right? So it's a lens that I think is helpful when we're thinking about these different types of oppression. And I'll give you a particular type of oppression in our next one, which is when we think about, in our next slide, when we think about racism, that's an opportunity for us to have this example of a certain kind of oppression and how it operates at different levels, right? So we've got this kind of interpersonal individual level, we have this institutional level at which it operates, and this systemic level. And we know that Canada, for example, we like to talk about our country in these really positive ways sometimes, but we also have been faced with the hard reality, the reality that we are still a very much a racist society, and there's a lot of racism built into the structure, right, of our systems. And one example is our immigration policy. We talk about that at OCASI, right, how it's built in. And so that means it's not just about dealing and addressing with being anti-racist at an interpersonal level, but seeing the importance of it at an institutional level when we're thinking about policies, when we're thinking about, and thinking about it at that systemic level as well. Like, what are the bigger things that we need to do in order to challenge anti-racism. All right, and so I'm going to move on to, we're getting closer to me recovering over here some of the different approaches. Another one that might be familiar, again, I have a feeling if we were in the room and I was talking about trauma and violence informed approaches, I feel a lot of people would raise their hand. And so this is a concept that's really about emphasizing the connection between trauma and violence. So we're not just talking trauma informed, but also trauma and violence informed approaches. And this is really about increasing well-being, control and resilience for people who are looking for services related to experiences of GBV or violence, or have experienced violence in the past. And the point is to reduce the possibility of any re-traumatization, any type of triggering or reactivation flare-ups that can take place when we're talking about these sensitive subjects, or when we have people who are coming to organizations to disclose things that may have happened to them, right, in the current. So it's about keeping that in mind. And I think there's really great examples, and within this working group here with this project, I've learned a lot as well when we're talking about trauma and violence informed in practice. And so it's about communication, it's about having also certain practices, and this is like an approach, right, that needs to be integrated and practiced by all of the people that work in an organization, not just exclusively to those who might be meeting with clients who've experienced GBV, but to have trauma and violence informed organizations. We think that's also a really important part. So moving on to the triple trauma paradigm. So this one here is the triple trauma paradigm is about thinking about a person also in a holistic way, and thinking about past, present, future, right? So we're thinking about the pre-flight, so understanding and preventing kind of GBV and thinking about GBV within newcomer immigrant communities does require us to think about these things, right? Like, what was it like before the person arrived in Canada, right? The pre-flight, we talk about that, right? And how that it introduces a different type of stress and introduces a different type of reality. What would it have been like for that person in flight, right? We're thinking, there's examples here of like food insecurity, separation, lack of trust. And then also then the concept and the talk about what happens in resettlement. So this is about keeping that reality in mind when we're doing work in terms of wanting to be effective, when we're thinking about risk assessment or risk management, safety planning, all of those things. When we're looking at the client face to face and you're working with them, these are things to keep in mind, right? And I'm going to move on to the last one, which also comes up a lot. You probably hear it a lot when you're working with newcomer, refugee, immigrant communities, is this concept of cultural humility and cultural safety. So this is where it really is about reflection. I mean, I think there's a lot of emphasis in the literature around that in particular, right? That self-reflection. We all have biases. We all have things that we're working on a day-to-day basis, right? Because when these things are built into our system, it means that we internalize it, it becomes indoctrinated, and sometimes we're not able to see that reality in our own practices, despite having the best of intentions, right? So this is really about kind of doing that inner work, trying to maintain kind of a respectful process and relationship with the clients that you're working with. So cultural humility is this combination of being informed and not knowing at the same time, right? It's an ongoing process of learning and unlearning, being conscious of differences and considering our own behaviors, attitudes, right? Sometimes difficult to separate ourselves from our own kind of baggage, but the point here is that ongoing practice of reflection and trying to build further awareness. Cultural safety are, when we're thinking more specific, that kind of the approaches, right, that are going to recognize and challenge unequal power relations between service providers and between the clients. And so when I think of cultural humility and cultural safety, I'm just going to quickly wrap up here. I think that's something very specific we hear within kind of settlement work and the newcomer, immigrant, refugee, but it's another kind of interpretation and adaptation of centering the clients, of thinking of strength-based work, right? So if you're already familiar with those framings, this should be something else, something else you add to that recipe to think about. So I think that it's an important thing for us to consider, especially when we have to think about survivors who, their culture might be different, values, preferences. And so how do we keep that into account? How do we make our spaces the most safe as possible for all those people we're serving? Okay, I spoke a lot. I shared a lot in there. This is that moment where it's helpful for the people presenting, and it's also helpful for the people in the audience to just take a moment, take a breath, check in with ourselves. It's a lot of information to take in. Again, we tried to do that when more of an overview style, but there's resources and information if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into those topics. So while we're taking this short kind of break, you can move around, you might take a sip of your tea, but we also wanted to, share our gratitude to service providers like you who are here on the call, who are taking the time to learn, who are interested and enthusiastic about learning as well, and you care. You're here to discuss this issue and you care about those who are experiencing crisis. And so we want to make sure that we honor your time, and we're grateful for you being here with us.
Okay. Hey, excellent. So I'm going to take over and we're going to talk about using that trauma and violence informed lens. So it means being aware of that connection between trauma and violence and how that connection impacts people's lives. So when we use this approach, it allows us to minimize the risk of re-victimizing survivors of violence when we're delivering our services. So yeah, what does it mean to be trauma informed? So the goal of being trauma informed is to minimize harm, not necessarily not to treat the trauma, right? So trauma and violence informed approaches are not about treating that trauma, for example, through counseling or chronic pain interventions. Instead, the focus is to minimize the potential for harm and re-traumatization to enhance safety, control, and resilience for all clients involved with the systems or programs that we're providing. And when we use these approaches, it actually ends up benefiting everyone, whether or not they have experienced trauma in their lives or their personal history is not known to the service provider. So it's a great approach to take because it's actually helpful to everyone, even those who haven't experienced that. Yeah, so understanding trauma is an important part of being trauma informed. So trauma is a traumatic event that involves either a single experience or enduring repeated or multiple experiences, which is often what we see with GBV survivors. And what happens with these experiences is they completely overwhelm the individual's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and emotions involved in that experience. So it's not really the event that determines whether or not something is traumatic to someone, but it's actually that individual's experience of the event and the meaning that they make of it. So traumatic events often cause feelings of shame due to the powerlessness they create, which can lead to secrecy and further embed the experience of shame. So when we're silent, then we experience that even deeper. Yeah, and then it becomes something that is greatly feared and that we need to avoid. So people affected by trauma from abusive relationships will frequently encounter services that actually mirror the power and control that they've experienced in those relationships. So when we're being trauma informed, we want to be mindful of that, and we want to ensure that we're not holding on to all the power and control, that we're working collaboratively with individuals. So so trauma and learning is next. Yeah, so trauma can have lasting effects on learning. And when we think about when we're like facilitating groups or we're working with individuals even, we need to keep this in mind that in order to be able to learn, we need spaces that feel safe and welcoming. We need to be able to take risks and take in new information. So we also need to be able to focus and relax. So when we're bringing people into a space, we want to make sure that the environment is conducive to learning. And also understanding that trauma has lasting effects on the ability to learn. So it can impact people by having, they can have difficulty concentrating with memory, sleep. Often with trauma experiences, there can be things like nightmares, exhaustion, headaches, stomach aches, hyper alertness, pervasive fear or anxiety, or there can even be like flashbacks and memories from those traumatic events. So when we're facilitating with groups or running programs, what we want to do is we want to keep that in mind, and we want to prepare ahead of time so that we're providing an environment is safe. So the first step would be our own awareness. So that would be making sure that we're regulating our own emotions. We reflect on our relationships to those topics, right? Reflect on maybe some of our biases or our own opinions and how those could maybe be harmful or helpful to the individuals that we're working with. And then also practicing our own self-compassion and self-care. We also want to acknowledge that trauma is pervasive in society, and that society is designed for it, right? So we want to prepare if there are going to be any disclosures of gender-based violence during or following the session, right? So if we're prepared, then we're ready for if that does occur. So yeah, another way for trauma-informed facilitation is to make the training universally accessible for survivors, regardless of whether or not the learners are disclosing trauma. We want to take steps also to avoid re-traumatizing our participants. So when we don't understand the complexity, and lasting impacts of violence and trauma, we may unintentionally re-traumatize the individuals that we're working with. So the goal is really to minimize harm with the people we serve, and we don't need to know if they've even had experiences of violence to work in a trauma-informed way. Yeah, so when we run groups, we want to create an emotionally safe space. I know some of our best practices at Elmwood Community Resource Center is that we start off all our groups right after we do our kind of welcome. We sit with the group and we create guidelines together. So again, we're handing over the power to the participants of the group to tell us what it is that they want to be safe. It actually makes our job easier too, because we're not guessing. The participants are telling us what that they need from us and from each other to feel safe. We always like to have 2 facilitators available. That way, if there is a disclosure or if somebody becomes triggered during the group, then there's somebody there to support them. If we're talking about sensitive topics, we also let people know that hey, if you're feeling triggered or that this information may bring up feelings for us, and we, even at the beginning of this presentation, encourage people to use self-care practices to help keep themselves healthy and well. I know one of the group guidelines we usually implement with our groups is that if people are leaving the room, they need to give us a thumbs up. If they don't, that's signaling to them that they do need support if they're leaving the room when we're running a group. Yeah, so, and then we also plan with the participants what they're going to do. Yeah, so another thing about being trauma-informed that we really wanted to include in this presentation today is the use of language. So we want to really be mindful of the language that we're using because we can unintentionally reinforce harmful myths or stereotypes or again, re-traumatize individuals. Also, when we're facilitating groups, we want to think about the CLB level of the participants that we're working with and make sure that we're using language that is accessible to them to understand. So we just want it to be, simple, straightforward. And then again, when we're working with an individual or even in the group, is we want to mirror the words that they use to describe any of the experiences that they're sharing with us. So it's highly unlikely that people use the words victim, survivor, abuser. More likely they will say like, oh, my boyfriend, or this friend that I'm kind of seeing currently. So when we're talking to them about that individual, using the same words that they've used to describe that individual. Yeah, so now I'm going to go to Valerie. Next part.
Hi, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about how to handle disclosures of violence. So whether individually or in groups. Next slide. But before I do that, I just want to just talk very, very briefly about the dynamics, specifically in an intimate partner violence situation. So Margarita covered some of this already. Gender-based violence is really about power and control. And it's on a continuum. So it doesn't always just look like physical violence, right? It can look like much more subtle forms of violence that are not necessarily crimes, but they're violence nonetheless, such as emotional violence, economic violence. So if you're not familiar with the power and control wheel that you see on your screen, I'd encourage you to Google it and look through it, and it really describes some of the different ways that someone can exert that power over someone else, and the layers and the complexity. Next slide. And so there's actually a power and control wheel that's been adapted specifically for immigrant women. So it has all the same kind of power and control dynamics, and then some additional ones that, so basically, for example, here on the left of the wheel, it says using citizenship or residency privilege, so as a way to control them. So someone who may not, know the resources in the systems and their rights coming into the country, who may not have, a full immigration status, someone else can use that against them, right? And can threaten to have them deported, or, have their children taken away. And whether they're right or not, that's a scary thing to hear. And so it's a way that that they can use control. So next slide. So if a disclosure was made in a group setting, for example, so you're doing group programming, two things to keep in mind. So the first thing would be to show empathy and validate the person's experience, just very briefly show that, you're there for them and you understand. And second would be to ensure safety and confidentiality. So if it's in a group setting, you want to, if they want to, talk further about it, you want to try to find a confidential private space where you can have that conversation. So that might sound like, thank you for sharing your experience. It sounds like you may have gone through, gender-based violence, and I'd like to invite you to talk about this further in private. What that might look like, inviting them, it could be inviting them to a separate room. As Charlene said, ideally you have two facilitators so that one of them is free to kind of step out with the client if that's what they want. If it's a virtual session, you could use breakout rooms, or you can offer to call or see them after the session if needed. But putting that emphasis on confidentiality right from the start is really important to create that safety. And so as they begin a disclosure, you might want to remind them about the limits of confidentiality. So just reminding them that what they share with you is confidential. However, you have legal obligations to break their confidentiality if you find out that a child is in danger. And by saying that right away, you then give the client the control and the choice to disclose to you, and what information they choose to disclose to you. So again, if you were in a group setting and you had limited time to respond, so once you've taken the person aside in a private space, if you don't have enough time to kind of hear the whole disclosure and spend an hour with the person, or maybe you're not the person who's going to be working with them going forward. So we've written down just 5 kind of brief steps that you can do if you have kind of limited time with the person. So the first thing would be to just reassure them that there is help available if they need it. And then either make a follow-up appointment with yourself or with that, caseworker or anti-violence worker who you're going to refer them to. But as you're doing this appointment, either with yourself or with someone else, you want to make sure that their number is safe to call, or find a way that is safe to communicate with them. So keeping that in mind, because if you were to just call them up and let's say they are living with an abusive partner, then you could actually put them in danger by doing that. And then you want to check in with them and see if it's safe where they're staying. Sorry, if it's safe where they're staying in that moment, at that time. And if not, if they would like to access a shelter, and you can help them with that. And at the very least, I always say, provide them a 24-hour helpline number, because you never know, this could be your only opportunity to intervene. This person may not come back, you may not see them again. So at least if you know that they have that 24-hour helpline number, you know that they can call and get resources if needed. Okay, so in a case where you did have more time to receive a full disclosure, or in a case where you are, the caseworker who's going to be working with that person, then here are some more detailed steps on how to make sure that that disclosure is handled in a way that's trauma and violence informed. So first of all, you want to listen without judgment, and I'm sure you do this already with your clients, but it is really, really important in the case of gender-based violence, because most likely they'll have been told, or they'll have been made to believe that they won't be believed, and that they might be blamed as well. So you just really want to counter that narrative and show that you're there, you're not judging, you're going to believe them and validate them. So you want to stay calm and avoid strong emotional reactions, because you want to show them that you are able to receive that information. And if you were to have a strong emotional reaction, there's a chance that then the survivor may feel like they need to now take care of you or your feelings. So that kind of dynamic can switch. And then they might actually feel like they have to minimize their own experience in order to make you feel comfortable. So again, you want to remind them that it's not their fault. Like, you can't cause someone to abuse you, and everyone is responsible for their own behavior. So that one's really important. And you want to provide them choices and options. So as service providers, sometimes we get tempted to kind of come in and rescue the person, and just make everything better. But that's not how that works in this situation, because basically that person will probably have experienced control in either an intimate relationship or in an experience of GBV. And so as service providers, we run the risk of replicating those controlling dynamics if we kind of come in and try to tell them, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. So we want to do kind of the opposite. We want to empower them to make their own choices and really give them back the power, and providing them options, brainstorming with them. So you're there to accompany, but not tell them what to do. And then finally, you want to reduce the number of times that the client has to tell their story, because that can be re-traumatizing. So as service providers, we have to be very patient and respect the client's rhythm, because we have to understand that actually most survivors choose to not report to the police, and that's okay. And there's really good reasons for that. Like Margarita was talking about, the intersection between violence, and then there's racism and structural oppression. So we have to really be mindful of that, and that the police is not always the answer. So they may not want to call the police, and that's okay. They may not want to leave the relationship if it's an abusive relationship either. And it's a very complex situation with lots of power dynamics and complexity. And you can think about it as kind of a spider web, like those webs of control that's being spun around the victim or survivor. And they're hard to see that they're there, but they're really, they're really there, and they're really holding that person feeling stuck. So basically, the average number of times that someone goes back to an abusive relationship is about 6 times, because of that complexity. So we really have to be patient as service providers and always receive them in that non-judgmental way, even though sometimes it can feel frustrating, right? So there's types of questions that we want to avoid, which are kind of questions that can feel interrogating. So we want to avoid why type questions. So ones that would maybe reinforce some harmful stereotypes. So we want to avoid saying, you know, why didn't you just leave, for example? And instead we want to ask how type questions or what type questions that really open up the floor to the survivor to, like I said, make their own choices and write their own story, right? So how can I help you? How do you want to go about doing this, right? How are you coping? Next slide, please. And I'll hand it back over to my colleague, Charlene.
Hey, excellent. So I'm going to keep the safety planning section a little bit brief because a lot of the stuff we've already covered that we would take into consideration in our safety plan. So safety planning, I'm sure some of you have heard of it before, you may already be using it, but the general I guess, purpose of a safety plan is to support that individual who's disclosing that violence. We're evaluating their safety and then helping to put that down in an action plan so that if they are faced with the violence again, they have I guess, a map as to what they're gonna do. And also when we're working with an individual to make that safety plan, we're helping them recognize where there would be instances of increased danger or risk to themselves. And I always like to just like acknowledge that like individuals who are disclosing to you up until this point, they have in lots of different ways been keeping themselves safe. So a lot of the safety plan is sometimes like asking them like, how have you been doing that? And then including those things that they're already doing in that plan. And then maybe also asking some of those questions so that we can help them consider things they may not have before. So so a safety plan includes the current situation of risks and is trying to find ways for them to remain safe when the violence is occurring or has the potential to occur. And it can be highly individualized. So we do encourage you to, check online for safety plans that are available. So, and it's also beneficial if we discuss how to adapt the strategies in various situations that they may be facing. And the part of the safety plan as well is we can't just have one strategy to end violence, right? And not every one strategy will work for every woman. So often leaving, like Valerie mentioned earlier, it may take an individual 7 attempts before they actually leave a violent situation. So the safety plan is to find ways to keep them safe while they're in that process of maybe deciding to leave or address the violence in another way. So just kind of talking about some of the risk factors, as Valerie was sharing, like individuals are at increased risk when they start to make a plan to leave as well. So just letting them know that some risk factors are provided here on the slide. So if there's been threats to the individual, if the perpetrator of the violence against them has access to things like weapons, guns, that's an increased risk factor. If there's mental health or substance use, again, increased risk, or pregnancy is actually a high risk time for women to experience intimate partner violence. So if there is a crisis or if the violence is occurring, there's some important things that we want to know, right? So if they're in crisis, we want to make sure that we've given them access, like Valerie was saying, to 24/7 supports. Usually those are done territorial. So I know here in Manitoba, we have family violence prevention hotline that people can call where they'll have access to supports. And the hotline also knows which shelters are available or open. And that can even be a resource that you could use with an individual if they've made a disclosure to you. So if you're feeling not confident about being able to make a safety plan with them, you can even, I know some of our workers will call that line and have the experts there walk them through that process with that individual who has disclosed. Yeah, and we've already touched on leaving isn't always the best. One of the things that we do sometimes suggest for individuals is to have a go bag. And so that's just where they would like keep important documents, maybe an extra set of clothing, any spare keys, prescriptions, things like that, that if they decide to leave in a hurry, then they can take those things with them and have them available. So yeah, I don't want to go too far into that because I know we're getting low on time. But we also just like want to let you know that when we're working with an individual who's responding, who is disclosing to us about violence, and we're working towards establishing a safety plan with them, is just remembering that their situation is unique. We want to try and suspend any judgments we have or make any assumptions, right? It's always better to just ask questions rather than assume we know what's going on for them. We want to be patient, and again, checking in on that risk. And when we think about the power and control that these individuals have faced as well, we just want to make sure that we're always asking for their permission before we do things like calling 911. So we can ask like, hey, do we need to call police? Are you okay with that? Or hey, would you like to call one of the local shelters to see if we can go there? And then we have a quote here from Maya Angelou, and she said that I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So just keeping that in mind as well, is that when we're working with individuals, we want them to feel safe because they're more likely to come back. We want them to feel heard and empowered to make the best decision for themselves. Because up until this point, they have survived and they have kept themselves safe, and now they're here with you. So just encouraging them to continue doing that, and also providing them with information and support.
Thank you so much, Charlene. So I have about 8 minutes, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly and just try to highlight a few considerations when working with newcomers around this subject. So we've covered a lot, but I'm going to highlight a few extra pieces. So we'll go to the next one. So again, we covered a lot of things, but it's really important that we need to be able to reach out to different service providers and collaboration. A lot of newcomers may only be trusting the first organizations that they connect with. That might be whoever's teaching them language classes, might be settlement services. So it's really important that we're really working on collaboration to make sure that there's easier referrals, as well as everyone's getting access to the right information. Newcomers are getting information constantly at the beginning when they are arriving, and it can be overwhelming and confusing. So this is really important. We also need to educate ourselves. And so again, we need to make sure that we're always making sure that GBV awareness is part of any type of programming that's directly for newcomers. So this could be anything from language classes, discussions, or different opportunities, because again, we don't know where they're getting the information. And again, we want to make sure they're getting it frequently, particularly where to go for help, laws, supports, and things like that. So we'll continue on as well. We covered a lot about this immigration-related vulnerability. So Margarita did talk about how it's really important that we're mindful of these things, and that people's status can impact the way that they're accessing supports and service, their eligibility, and their risk factors as well. So again, it's really important that when we're working with newcomers, that we know what their status is to make sure that we can connect them to the appropriate resources, but also because we know that sometimes status can be used as a threat around people accessing support. So for example, I work at the YMCA at the Immigrant Center. Oftentimes we'll hear people who are victims or survivors saying, oh, the perpetrator of violence is threatened that if I tell anyone, then I could be at risk of deportation. So we really need to make sure that we take away these myths and we access the correct legal supports if needed. So again, Margarita covered a lot of challenges. And again, these are barriers to accessing supports and services. So if we look at all these different colors and we think about all the things that we just covered around racism and language barriers and things, it's really important that we recognize that newcomers do have different barriers to accessing services. And one that I just want to emphasize, and Margarita mentioned too, is fear of stigma from their own community, as well as isolation. Those can be really connected. Oftentimes, a lot of our supports and services are specific to a perpetrator to victim situation. So if we think of protection orders or any type of thing like that, but oftentimes there's not protection mechanisms from backlash from a wider community. So these are considerations we have to think about, as well as sometimes a lot of newcomers may not want to accuse someone within the same cultural or religious community, because maybe that community is very small and maybe that's their main support system here in a new country. So sometimes that may be a weighing factor, as if they feel like they're going to be judged or isolated because of accusing someone of violence, this could really impact their decision making around accessing a support. And I also just want to also mention the lack of awareness about community services. Again, even just, are there translation services? Is it very easy to tell which ones include the police, which ones don't, and what types of service? Particularly, do people have to leave in order to access those supports and services? So we'll continue on. We also covered a lot about this, but again, we're just reinforcing that we really need to be mindful of the intersectionality of people's experiences and how that can play. And I think we've covered that quite well. But again, just really make sure that we're not just looking at people as one identity, as like a newcomer or particular. We need to think about all the different things of race, class, how they immigrated here, their socioeconomic status, the different services they may have already accessed, or systems that they might already be part of. So it's really important that we're thinking about those things and can consider the participants' risk and safety within the context of their social location. Other considerations when responding, we need to make sure that we're using really, really simple language to facilitate conversation. So we're not abbreviating or using jargon. And also, we don't want to assume that someone is fluent in English, even if they speak English quite well. It's important that we really try to be mindful of that language needs, particularly, and offering translation services when available, particularly when people are trying to explain sensitive or emotional or traumatic events. It's easier to explain in your own language, as well as it's important for us to be able to ask the questions around safety, or if there's any steps that they need to take. We need to make sure that that's very clear. And as we mentioned a few times, we need to be non-judgmental and always ask about children, because again, you might have different rules and regulations based on where you're living around necessary measures if children are also in the home. And the last thing I want to mention too around this slide is that we also need to be mindful of other options and resources that are available. So again, collaborating with anti-violence sector, but also maybe organizations that work with the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, or health services or victim services. There's many different organizations that we can partner and work with. So the other thing we need to make sure is that sometimes people will get into a debate. So I work with newcomers, we raise awareness on GBV prevention, and sometimes people will bring up culture or religion, and it can cause getting into a debate, or family matters or private matters is something else sometimes we hear. We need to explain that violence is not tolerated. These are the things that count as violence, and always refer to human rights. We always refer to human rights and the laws. And this is a way to kind of minimize debating different understandings of relationships or rules or different things, as connecting to the law and connecting to human rights, and that, you know, we're not debating different perceptions on things, but we are just making sure that everyone has the right to live safe and free of violence in Canada. We also need to be careful that we're not like sharing information without consent unless necessary, especially if we work in centers that work with the whole family, or a perpetrator and someone who might be a victim or survivor. So we really need to make sure that we are being careful of privacy, careful of safety, And again, also, if you're not someone who works in the anti-violence sector, as some of the amazing people on our panel, is making sure that you don't have to have all the answers. You can call and ask for support, even if your client doesn't want to access supports and services. I call victim services a lot just for advice, particularly with high-risk situations. Again, I already mentioned this about language barriers, but one last thing I will mention is make sure that if you can and you live in a small area, get a list of possible translators. If you are getting a translator, make sure it's not a family member. Make sure you can ask even gender and even the names. That way, if there's a perceived or an actual connection, because some communities are quite small, then the person can have a choice to say if they're comfortable with any of these interpreters or translators, just to make sure that they're not connected to the perpetrator or have any safety issues. So we're going to talk about referrals really quick because I know we have about 30 seconds. So we'll go to the next slide for referrals. So again, really make sure you're trying to provide it in their own language if possible. Really, again, we already mentioned the safety plan. Always discuss people's rights. Sometimes newcomers don't know their rights in Canada. They don't know what the options are. So please discuss that. And again, it's really important that when we're making referrals, that we're supporting them through that process. So the next slide, I'm going to kind of mention that too. So when we do referrals, we need to really know what we're referring to. So when I call someone, I can know here's what they're going to ask. Here's what's going to happen if we call this organization. Here are different steps, or these are different questions they might ask. I can prepare people. I also can do it with someone. I can also give necessary context with the permission of the client to give support or advice to that organization if they're not used to working with newcomers, other factors that they might not consider. And again, we always want to make sure we're confirming consent. And again, because we really want to do, as we were talking about, empower the client to feel like they're, well, not to feel, but so that they have agency over what's happening to them. Yes, and so the last thing, again, collaboration, coordination among service providers. We really need to make sure that the people working with newcomers, the people who are working in the anti-violence sector, and any other organization, that we are working together. Again, families are often involved in multiple systems and organizations. We want to find ways, again, with clients' permission, to collaborate, to really support people in all aspects. And again, that will increase the family's overall safety as well as the individual. So again, we're going to mention our project resources next, and that can give you a lot of updates. So I apologize for being very quick, but I hope that helped a little bit.
Here we are collecting questions and answers. There's a Q&A button on your screen. It's two little bubbles of conversation, and we have one question there so far. And so I'm going to be reading out the questions shortly, and I'll invite the panelists to turn on our cameras, and just briefly going to touch on our project tools and resources so that people know that we're part of a partnership that's working on a national strategy on gender-based violence for the settlement sector in partnership with the anti-violence sector. So we have a project website and several resources that we've developed, including a strategy, an online course, and organizational framework for responding to GBV. These things are all available for settlement workers, or the target audience, the main group that could benefit from accessing all these tools and resources. But certainly others are also invited, anti-violence sector workers and organizational leaders. So a lot of students have been involved, volunteers in the sectors. We have a webinar series that's there recorded, as well as a SettleNet group, which of course people are welcome to join. And all of the resources will be available on the P2P platform here that we're part of today. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm just gonna, again, like I said, invite people to turn on their cameras, and I'll see what I can do here with facilitating the questions and answers. Let me see here. So the first question is here, what kind of strategies do you use or know or suggest to encourage women dealing with gender-based violence to come forward and seek help in the first place? So we'll just give the panelists a minute to think on that. What kind of strategies do you use, know of, or suggest to encourage women who may be dealing with gender-based violence to come forward and seek help in the first place?
I can mention one quickly if we want to just, with some of the programming that we support, and also at OCASI, and that supports other organizations. Relationship building is really important. And sometimes you're thinking about GBV and the programming specifically, but actually having kinds of open groups and having opportunities where people can break the isolation. They can be part of different programming that's more at a general level. It might even be taking place in English classes or activities. We find that's a really important place. So the relationship building aspect of it. So building community, finding opportunities where you're inviting people to programming an organization. It might not start off as a conversation about GBV, but that's actually a better approach, talking about it in a general way. Building those relationships and building trust is what will then create or facilitate opportunities for people to feel actually safe enough to perhaps disclose or to hear about other resources. So I'll pass it over to Brianna, but that's a place to start.
No, I fully agree with Margarita. That's definitely like number one, is the relationship building and creating spaces for people to connect. The other thing I will say is, from experience at our center, is that raising awareness and actually just talking about it, sometimes just like making it not a taboo subject. So yeah, we do workshops and awareness on different forms of violence and awareness through once we've built the relationships and trust. And we find that oftentimes once we do a workshop on laws or rights or healthy families or what does that, people then come forward because they're like, oh, that's me, because they're recognizing what counts.
I think I would just add to, as Charlene was explaining, creating emotionally safe spaces and, trauma-informed approaches, just basically applying these ideas and approaches all the time to all clients, also like builds that safe space where people will eventually hopefully feel safe enough to disclose. So even though the disclosures might not come right away, it's just important to always have those things in mind when working with clients, and then slowly you can build that safe space.
And I'll just add one final thing. It can even be like posters and visuals that we have in our office spaces or on our walls, right? That encourage people to speak up about things that they're facing, right? So like I've had it happen before where someone's come into our drop-in and they've seen a poster about an up-and-coming group about understanding GBV, and they've been like, oh, like, is that something you guys help with? And then it's kind of opened that door, that conversation for that person.
Excellent. So there's 3 more questions here on our Q&A list, and one of them is around standard protocols and procedures, a tool that service providers could use or adapt for their own work. And so we do have in our project a framework that we developed, got lots of feedback on, in terms of organizational readiness for working in the area of gender-based violence, some things that will really help promote awareness and knowledge building and responses. So I think that maybe one of our members can put that in the Q&A, the link to our project website. And the other question that is being asked here is a sample safety plan. If someone has a sample safety plan that could be looked at.
I mean, I can jump in and just say you can Google safety plan and you'll probably find some on different shelter websites. Or you can, maybe more importantly, you can contact your kind of local anti-violence, either shelters or programs or even victim services, and they'll probably have something, you know, that they use that they can share with you. And maybe you can even invite them to come in and you know, discuss it with you in detail and start a relationship that way.
Good. And then, right, so here's the link to our project website if people can access it in the Q&A here. And the other question was about, yep, protocols and procedures tool. In this presentation that we shared today, there's several links that will answer some of these questions. I think there is even one to a sample safety plan, or at least some of the questions to consider in safety planning. But of course, as Valerie said, knowing more about your local community resources and organizations is really important. Okay, so there's another question around what role do resources and services for the perpetrators play in reducing GBV? So yeah, does anybody want to speak to that? We didn't go into working with perpetrators much in this presentation. It's a whole other field or area of work. And definitely I would look for experts in that area in your own community who are working with perpetrators or people who have used violence before. There are some programs, especially through victim services, that are helpful. But is there any other input into that around resources and services for perpetrators?
Can I just add one comment to that? I think it's a great question. And I think there's, like Catherine said, there are definitely resources out there and groups that focus on that specifically. And I do think that it is a part of our general conversation on addressing GBV. We know that that's part of the work in addressing it and actually getting to a place where we can say we're trying to really eradicate GBV, right? We can't, I find for folks that might be interested, I find it's really some great literature that's out there is literature that also questions our reliance, for example, on a criminal justice system or on police. Like there's conversations there that that kind of add a lot more nuance and perspective in trying to understand different approaches that communities might have when we know that some communities are disproportionately impacted and over criminalized, or, you know, and so there's a conversation there about futures, the future of that work, the future of addressing GBV. This is our current reality that we're in. And so we have, this is within the system we're working, but I think it is interesting to read the literature about the future of this work and how we really do it from a perspective that's able to engage without, you know, removing the priority that is the, you know, working with survivors and the experience of GBV and the supports and services, but hearing that narrative and understanding where that perspective comes from and best ways to really engage with perpetrators, and because that is the long-term way of addressing GBV, and that's what that literature really highlights. So I can share some of those resources to Catherine that have been really helpful, and perhaps if people want, we could send that out.
Can I jump in quickly? I would also just add that any services for men who have used abuse, for example, it is really important that they be grounded in a feminist, intersectional feminist analysis, just because sometimes there's also a risk that if it's not grounded in, you know, in a place that comes from knowledge of gender-based violence, sometimes it could actually reinforce some harmful norms and myths. So just kind of being mindful of that.
In our strategy document, there is a priority around engaging men and boys, and there's some links there on our project website, the GBV strategy, to different programs and services that work with men and boys, and there's quite a lot of inspiring information and programs there. So the last question that we have here is around what kinds of strategies can help women to have self-confidence. And I've had the opportunity to look at this question for a little bit, and I really want to reflect on the work that we do in settlement organizations for like traditional types of settlement programming that are seasonal, that are fun, that are engaging, that are community building. And these have the added bonus for adults and youth and gender specific groups, women in this case you're asking about, of helping people feel more connected, a sense of belonging, being able to talk about themselves and get to know other people, and definitely that kind of programming, women's groups where you do some activities together, get to know each other, maybe go for a hike, get connected with nature, all those really fun, engaging settlement activities that we do all across the country with settlement workers really will really help with self-confidence and are a way to build trust, to build connection, and to provide information orientation. And in this case, to provide information orientation about gender-based violence so that we can be prepared if somebody does need help in that regard, or they know of somebody else who needs help in the neighbors, friends, and families model, we're able to respond in a positive way, in a caring way, with some knowledge and background of the topic. So that's the some reflection there on helping women to have self-confidence. I don't know if anybody else.
Yeah, I can add just again, feeding off of what Catherine said. One of the things too, especially working with newcomers, is oftentimes people will think about what they can't do yet. So like maybe language, or maybe they're still looking for work if that's something that they're looking for. So really be strength-based and celebrating their strengths. So finding ways to celebrate culture, finding ways to connect to things that they're already good at, build skills that they're interested in. If they're interested in photography, or helping ask some of the women to like co-lead with you. Hey, like if someone's coming a lot, like, do you want to help lead a little check-in with the women next week? We really find that our women and our women's groups really find a lot of opportunity, as Catherine was saying, to peer support each other. So opportunities for them to learn from each other, from their own shared experiences. And that I find is like one of the best things to build confidence, because they're like, oh yeah, I have things to offer, and I have stories to share, and I have ways that I can help each other. So creating more of that peer supportive space is important.
And I would just add one more thing to help build that confidence, is like Brianna was saying, that strengths-based perspective. So also validating their experiences as real right? And letting them know that like them feeling afraid or upset or shame, these are all so normalizing their experience. And then also giving them the opportunity to make their own decisions, shows them that we trust them, right? So if we're calm and we're, asking them, well, what do you want to do? Instead of them coming to us as the experts, like, what should I do? It's like, well, you're the expert on your life. You're the one who gets to make these decisions. Even just allowing that can help build their confidence as well.
Well, I think this concludes our question and answer. We're over a couple of minutes, and we were able to share all of our information in the hour that we had. So I hope that everybody got something out of our time together. It seemed that we were up to around 29 participants at one point, at least from the Zoom end. And so we'll just pause now and say thank you so much for your participation. And we're wrapping up here our session on our gender-based violence settlement sector strategy, building capacity and collaboration. Thanks to all of the panelists for joining today, and to the organizers, and to you, the participants, for spending your time with us and thinking about gender-based violence awareness and this topic together here this afternoon. And all the best, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll end here. So thank you. Goodbye.